The snow fell gently on the quaint village of Chipping Cleghorn, settling in soft drifts atop gabled rooftops and cloaking the cobbled lanes in a serene whiteness. Fairy lights flickered in windows, wreaths dangled from old doors, and the scent of spiced mulled wine curled lazily through chimneys. It was Christmas Eve, and though the village appeared a postcard of peace and good cheer, something dreadful was quietly stirring at Little Paddocks. The grand house sat at the edge of the village green, its ivy-covered bricks and Victorian spires giving it a look of elegant isolation. Inside, the drawing-room was warm with firelight and tastefully adorned with holly and crimson ribbon. A towering Christmas tree reached almost to the ceiling, hung with delicate glass baubles, tinsel, and a silver star tilted precariously at the top. It was under this tree that the body was discovered. At precisely 9 o'clock that evening, the household had gathered in the drawing-room for brandy and carols. Letitia Blacklock, the owner of Little Paddocks, had invited a small circle of friends, an odd assortment of regulars from the village and house guests alike. Dora Bunny Bunner, Letitia's fluttery old companion, had just finished a slightly off-key version of the first Noel when the power suddenly cut out. There was a loud bang, 2, in fact, and a scream. Seconds later, the lights flickered back on. There was a shocked silence, and then someone gasped. Beneath the tree, face down in a heap of scattered presents, lay a man. A trickle of blood had already begun to seep into the white bearskin rug. No one recognized him. The man was in his 30s, his face pale, a gun still clutched in his lifeless hand. He had no identification on him, only a small, half-burned card in his coat pocket with the words, "Midnight, it ends tonight," scribbled hastily in black ink. The local constable, Inspector Craddock, arrived within the hour, summoned by a trembling telephone call. The guests, still shaken, were gathered in the dining room, sipping tea in lieu of brandy. Letitia Blacklock, composed but pale, recounted the incident calmly. "I don't know the man," she insisted. "None of us do. He must have crept in during the blackout." "But how?" Craddock asked, puzzled. The windows were latched from the inside. The only door into the drawing-room was locked, and no key is missing. It was, in every sense, a locked-room mystery. The inspector knelt beside the body. The gun was old, possibly pre-war, and though the man had seemingly shot himself, once in the chest, it wasn't quite convincing. The angle was odd. The powder burns inconsistent. There were no fingerprints, not even his own, on the weapon. That was when Miss Marple arrived. She had been visiting her niece in nearby Meddenham Wells, and, hearing of the shocking events from the grocer's boy, came at once. Her expression was calm as ever, her soft grey eyes missing nothing as she entered the drawing-room. She knelt beside the tree, inspecting the scene with quiet precision. "I see," she murmured almost to herself. "How very theatrical." "Miss Marple, this isn't the time for speculation," said Craddock with gentle exasperation. He knew her reputation, and also how she seemed to appear whenever the world twisted into something bizarre. "But it is exactly the time," she replied gently. "Christmas Eve, a dramatic murder under the tree, a stranger with no name, and all of it performed in front of a locked room full of witnesses. Someone wanted us to see this, but the real message, Inspector, lies not in the man's presence, but in his placement." She gestured at the tree, her gloved hand sweeping past the glass baubles. "Why there, of all places? Why under the tree?" Craddock looked down. The body was curled as if placed carefully, almost deliberately, among the wrapped gifts. A shattered ornament lay beside the man's hand. It looked like it had been crushed under his fall, but only that one. The rest of the tree remained oddly pristine. Miss Marple leaned in closer and examined the base of the tree. "Ah, as I feared." "What is it?" Craddock asked. "There's something missing," she said simply. "An angel, the kind often placed near the foot of a tree. A village tradition, I believe, here in Chipping Cleghorn. But this year the base was quite bare until he was added to it. Whoever planned this was replacing something symbolic, a sacrificial offering, if you will." Craddock stared at her. "You think this was staged? That someone placed him there after killing him?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached out and gently touched the piece of card found in the man's pocket. It was singed at one corner, the ink slightly smudged. "Tell me," she asked softly, "was there a fire recently?" Letitia blinked. No, well, yes, but it was only a small one. In the study a few days ago. A candle overturned, that was all. Did you lose anything? Letitia hesitated. Some papers, perhaps. A few old letters. Letters? Miss Marple's tone sharpened. Were any of them threatening? Letitia looked surprised. I don't know. I didn't read them all. There was an odd pause, and then Bunny, who had remained largely quiet, suddenly muttered, They said terrible things, those letters. Things about the past, about a will. I told her to burn them. Craddock perked up. A will? Miss Marple nodded slowly, a soft hum in her throat. Yes, I thought as much. Someone's inheritance, no doubt. And this man, perhaps he was connected to that. But no one recognizes him, Craddock protested. His face is unknown to every guest here. Because he wasn't meant to be recognized, Miss Marple said quietly. At least not by most, but someone here does know who he is, and someone here invited him. Craddock frowned. But how? You're suggesting this stranger didn't break in? No, she replied. He came in through the front door. She turned and looked straight at Letitia Blacklock. Letitia blinked, visibly shaken for the first time. I beg your pardon? I believe, Miss Marple said, stepping forward, that this man was not a stranger at all, but someone connected to your past. Someone you hoped to silence, perhaps by bribery or by fear. But something went wrong, and instead of disappearing quietly, he came here tonight to confront you or threaten you. Miss Marple's eyes flicked back to the card. Midnight. It ends tonight. That sounds like blackmail to me. There was a silence then, heavy, uncomfortable. Inspector Craddock cleared his throat. But if he was the blackmailer, why is he dead? Miss Marple's reply was soft, and yet it cut through the air like a scalpel. Because he wasn't the blackmailer, he was the victim. And with that, the mystery deepened, not lessened. The room, the gun, the tree, the unknown man, all were pieces on a chessboard, but Miss Marple had seen too many games in her time not to recognize a gambit when she saw one. This murder wasn't random, it was deliberate, and someone in the room had just made their opening move. Inspector Craddock, though sceptical of Miss Marple's quiet certainty, couldn't entirely dismiss her. The idea that the dead man was a victim rather than a perpetrator gnawed at him, and though nothing about the scene made logical sense, not the location of the body, not the lack of fingerprints, not even the cryptic message in the coat pocket, he sensed she was drawing on something more than deduction. She saw patterns where others saw noise. The guests were instructed not to leave little paddocks. The snow had thickened into a quiet blizzard by then, hemming them in, wrapping the village in white silence. Craddock ordered a search of the house, this time with fresh eyes, hoping to turn up anything that could link the unknown man to anyone present. Miss Marple, meanwhile, asked for tea. While the household resumed in a state of hushed confusion, she sat quietly in the drawing-room once more. The tree still glittered, eerily festive despite the horror that had taken place beneath it. The presents had been pushed aside, the rug now cleaned of its crimson stain, but Miss Marple's attention was not on the tree. She was looking at the gifts. She moved slowly, almost idly, scanning the tags. Most were ordinary, small trinkets or sweets labelled in flowing script. To Bunny from Letitia, to Patrick from Dora, and so on. But one tag, tucked behind the lowest branch, caught her attention. The handwriting was jagged, rushed, unlike the others, and it had no recipient. Simply, to you, it's time. She plucked it gently and placed it in her handbag without a word. Craddock returned shortly after, his expression grim. We found nothing new. The man's coat was old but good quality. No initials, no laundry tags, not a scrap of ID. Shoes polished, clean-shaven, no sign of forced entry anywhere in the house. It's like he appeared out of thin air. Or was invited, Miss Marple reminded softly. He hesitated. You're convinced one of the guests knew him? I don't believe in accidents of that kind, Inspector. Not on Christmas Eve, not beneath the tree, not in a locked room. It was staged, certainly, but for whom and by whom is the question. Craddock sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Letitia insists she's never seen him before. Yes, Miss Marple murmured. I'm sure she does. The following morning the guests reconvened in the sitting room at Craddock's request. Snow muffled the outside world. Inside, the tension had only grown. Letitia Blacklock sat in her usual high-backed chair, ramrod straight, her expression unreadable. Bunny hovered near her, wringing her lace handkerchief. Patrick and Julia Simmons, her distant relatives, lounged opposite, whispering to one another. Mitzi, the Eastern European maid, served tea in angry silence, muttering under her breath. And Miss Hinchcliffe and Miss Murgatroyd, neighbours who had dropped by the night before, sat stiffly by the fire. Miss Marple, unnoticed, observed them all. She watched the way Patrick's eyes drifted too often to the hallway. She noticed Julia's nails, one slightly chipped as if bitten during stress. She saw how Bunny flinched every time someone raised their voice, but most importantly she noticed something very small, barely there. Mitzi served Letitia's tea last, a porcelain cup with a delicate blue rim. When Letitia took the cup, she did not sip. She stared at it, then lowered it onto the saucer. "Is something wrong?" Miss Marple asked politely. Letitia looked up quickly. "Number just. A bit too much milk, that's all." Miss Marple smiled. "Ah, of course. People often forget your preference. You take it strong, just as your sister used to." Letitia's fingers clenched faintly on the saucer. "Yes. Well, it's an old habit." "Indeed. Family habits are often the hardest to break." Craddock cleared his throat. "Let's get to the point. Does anyone recognize the man who was found dead last night?" The room stayed silent. Miss Marple, still smiling gently, leaned forward. "Forgive me, but I wonder, could we talk about the mirror?" Craddock blinked. "What mirror?" "The one by the far wall, the one that should have reflected the entire drawing room. I noticed when I entered last night that it was covered by a red velvet cloth." Letitia frowned. "It was part of the decorations. I thought it looked better covered." Miss Marple turned slightly. "Of course, but it struck me as peculiar. The mirror is ornate from what little I could see. Victorian, beveled glass. Quite beautiful. And yet you chose to cover it only for last night. Why?" Letitia looked uncomfortable. I thought it might reflect the lights too brightly." "And yet," Miss Marple said gently, "it would also reflect anyone approaching from the hallway." A pause followed. "I believe," she continued, "that someone didn't want that. Someone in this room. Because if the mirror had not been covered, it might have shown us the moment our mysterious visitor entered, and we would have seen whether he was truly alone." Craddock stood straighter. "You're saying someone was with him?" "I am saying someone wanted us to believe he arrived in the blackout. But perhaps he was already inside. Perhaps he waited, hidden, until the moment was right. Until someone signaled. Or distracted." Mitzi spoke up suddenly, her voice loud and trembling. "You always look at me. You think because I am foreign I know something." "No, my dear," Miss Marple said, soothing, "but I did notice your apron was wet this morning." "I do laundry. Is crime now to clean?" "Certainly not," Miss Marple replied, "but the apron was hanging by the side door, near the coat closet, which is curious, because it wasn't used yesterday. That door was locked from the inside." Craddock frowned. "It still is." "Exactly. Yet the snow outside that door had been disturbed, briefly, as if someone stepped out, then back in." Letitia's voice was icy. "What are you implying?" Miss Marple's tone was warm, gentle. "Only that someone left something outside, or fetched something, perhaps a coat or a note, or perhaps they simply needed a moment to breathe. After all, an old acquaintance returning from the past can be quite distressing." Letitia rose suddenly. "This is ridiculous. You've turned a tragedy into theatre." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said kindly, "but as someone once told me, tragedy is always a matter of timing, and timing in this case is everything." Her eyes flicked to the old grandfather clock in the hallway. "Especially when it strikes 10 minutes slow." Craddock blinked. "What?" Miss Marple nodded to the timepiece. "It struck 9 precisely as the blackout occurred last night. But this morning I compared it to my watch, and it's 10 minutes behind, which means the blackout and the murder took place at 9:10, not 9:00. She looked back at the guests. "That's quite a significant detail. because it means whoever synchronized the event wasn't relying on that clock at all. A breathless silence fell. Someone in that room had known the exact time. Someone had planned it meticulously. And someone, Miss Marple thought, had just realized she was watching their every move. Inspector Craddock paced the drawing room as the guests sat stiffly, waiting to be questioned. The fireplace crackled softly in the background, but the warmth did little to ease the tension hanging in the air. Miss Marple remained seated near the tree, her knitting idle in her lap, her eyes calmly flicking from face to face. They began with Patrick Simmons. He slouched into the chair across from Craddock with a casual air, legs crossed, hands loosely folded in his lap. His flippant smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "I was on the sofa," Patrick said, gesturing toward the room's far corner. "Just there, right before the lights went out, I was teasing Bunny about her caroling. No offence, Bunny." Bunny gave a tremulous nod, unsure if she'd been insulted or not. And when the lights came back on, Patrick shrugged. Boom, there he was, dead as anything. I didn't see anyone move. Frankly, I thought it was a joke at first. Some bizarre Christmas prank. Very bad taste, obviously. Craddock scribbled a note. "You didn't hear footsteps? Voices? Anything suspicious?" "Only the gunshots. 2, I think. But it was chaos. Screams, chairs scraping, everyone moving at once." Miss Marple spoke up gently. "You mentioned you were on the sofa, but just now I noticed there's a small tear in your trouser cuff, a snag from something sharp. The sofa, you'll find, is upholstered in velvet." Patrick blinked, then laughed awkwardly. Well, I might have brushed against the hearth stand in the panic, or caught it on the tree." "Perhaps," she said mildly. Craddock dismissed him, and Bunny Bunner was brought in next. She perched nervously on the edge of the chair, her lace gloves twisted in her hands. "Oh, it was dreadful," she said, her voice high and fluttery. "One moment I was singing, and the next, bang, and then darkness. I screamed, I think. Everyone did. I thought it was a robbery." "Did you see anything?" Craddock asked. No, just shadows and confusion. Then the lights came back, and that poor man was under the tree." Miss Marple tilted her head. "You said something interesting yesterday, dear, about the letters. You told Letitia to burn them." Bunny blinked rapidly. "Did I? Oh, yes. Yes, of course. They were so upsetting, so rude, threatening, really." "Did you read them all?" No. I only saw the one, but Letty was so upset. She locked them away. She didn't want to worry anyone." Miss Marple smiled gently. "So, you didn't read the signature?" "The signature? Number no, I don't think so." "Curious," said Miss Marple softly, "because that particular letter was torn in half, and the signature was on the half that survived." Bunny's lips parted, but no sound came out. She began twisting her gloves faster. Oh dear, I must have forgotten." Craddock glanced at Miss Marple, frowning. Next came Julia Simmons. She strode into the room with practised poise, her hair elegantly pinned, her tone cool and measured. "I was near the window," she said, looking out at the snow. "The lights went out, and there was that noise. I ducked. Honestly, I thought something had exploded." "Did you know the man?" Craddock asked. "Never seen him before in my life." Miss Marple peered up at her. "You were near the window?" "Yes." "Odd, then," Miss Marple said, "that your boots were dry this morning. I saw them by the hallway, and yet the carpet by the window was soaked through. Someone had clearly been there shortly after the snow started. It would have taken no more than a moment to pull aside the curtains, lift the latch. Let someone in, perhaps." Julia's lips tightened. "Are you accusing me of opening the window?" "Not at all," Miss Marple said kindly. "Only that your account may have missed a detail or two." Julia crossed her arms. "I think you're reading far too much into a bit of wet carpet." "Quite possibly," Miss Marple murmured. They moved on to Mitzi. The maid sat with arms crossed and eyes blazing, refusing tea, refusing everything, her accent sharpened with every word. "You all think I killed him, because I am foreign. Always I am watched. Always I am blamed." "No one is accusing you," Craddock said patiently. "Just tell us what you saw." "I saw darkness. I saw people running. I saw no one shoot. I was in the kitchen, preparing the plum pudding. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. You weren't serving brandy then? No, I do not drink English brandy. Smells like varnish. Craddock cleared his throat. We're not asking about your preferences, just your location. I was alone. I always am. No one talks to me in this house. Miss Marple's voice softened. That must be terribly lonely, Mitzi. Mitzi's anger flickered into something smaller. They whisper about me, call me thief, say I steal biscuits. I do not. Only once. Mitzi, Miss Marple said gently, did you know the man who died? The maid hesitated. For a fraction of a second her gaze darted to Letitia, then back to her hands. Number never seen him. But the hesitation had been there. Miss Marple noted it. Last were Miss Hinchcliffe and Miss Murgatroyd, brought in together. They were inseparable in life, and appeared to be an investigation as well. We were just outside the drawing-room, said Hinchcliffe briskly. We'd come back in for our coats, heard the commotion. Awful business. Can't say we saw much. Murgatroyd nodded. Just a flash of something. A shadow, maybe. But it happened so fast, like a play it was. Did you see anyone move toward the tree? Craddock asked. Not clearly, Hinchcliffe said. Though I did think I saw someone near the side door. A figure. Tall. But then the lights went out, and when they came on he was already dead. You're sure it was the side door? Yes. Positive that at least matched something Miss Marple had noticed. Snow disturbed, a wet footprint, a faint scuff mark on the brass doorknob. But the door had been locked from the inside. The interviews concluded with silence. Craddock slumped in his chair, frustrated. They all contradict each other, he muttered. Not one of them gives the same account. Either they're lying or too frightened to tell the truth. They're lying, Miss Marple said calmly. But only partially. Each one is hiding something. Not necessarily the murder, but something. And lies, you know, tend to unravel when they're too neat. She looked toward the tree once more. It wasn't the man beneath it who mattered most. It was who put him there, and why. And I think someone here told us the truth, by accident. Craddock sat up. Who? She smiled faintly. Someone who described it as a play, and plays have scripts. A pause, then. You think it was rehearsed? No, she said. Worse. I think it was rewritten. She leaned back, her eyes now on the hallway beyond, where the broken threads of truth were beginning to gather, knotting slowly into something that resembled a noose. The snow had ceased by mid-afternoon, blanketing the village in a pristine hush that made little paddocks appear almost peaceful again. But inside the house the silence was tense, brittle. Each guest had returned to their rooms or found quiet corners to occupy themselves, though none could truly relax. There was a murder in the drawing-room, and worse yet, a murderer still among them. Inspector Craddock sat at the dining table, a stack of conflicting witness statements in front of him. Miss Marple, serene as ever, stood beside the sideboard, lightly brushing dust from a row of framed photographs. She wasn't searching for fingerprints or fibres. She was searching for people, for stories. I can't make it add up, Craddock muttered, rubbing his temple. They all have motives, every single one. Miss Marple turned slightly. Yes, that's the trouble with a clever murder, Inspector. It hides within the noise of too many reasons. Letitia Blacklock has the inheritance. She's the target in those letters. If anyone had reason to want a blackmailer dead, it's her. Miss Marple nodded. Quite so. But if she planned it, why stage such theatrics? Why not simply deny the letters or contact the police? Craddock frowned. Because she knew him? Perhaps. Patrick and Julia, barely connected to her, distant cousins or something, but they live under her roof, benefit from her wealth. Maybe they feared being written out of a will. Yes, Julia, in particular, is quite aware of appearances, and Patrick, I fear, enjoys being underestimated. Craddock tapped the statements. Then there's Bunny. Her testimony is the most inconsistent. She claims not to know the man, yet she blurted out details about the letters. Bunny is fragile, Miss Marple said, her voice gentle. But she's not stupid. She forgets facts when they frighten her, or when they contradict something she wishes to be true. That kind of self-deception is common in the elderly. We're not always ready to face the past. And Mitzi, odd girl, says she was in the kitchen, but her apron was found near the side door, lies constantly, but mostly about petty things. Miss Marple smiled faintly. She lies to protect herself, not to harm others. Fear can make people dishonest, but not necessarily dangerous. And what about the neighbours, Hinchcliffe and Murgatroyd? They were near the door when it happened. One claims to have seen a figure. But there's something else about them. Miss Marple's voice trailed off as she examined a framed photograph. Letitia Blacklock, much younger, with a tall, stately woman beside her. She turned back to Craddock. "Tell me, Inspector, have you verified Letitia's identity?" Craddock blinked. "What do you mean?" "Nothing concrete yet," Miss Marple said delicately. "Just a thought I've been circling. Identity is so often assumed, and in small villages, well, we accept people as they present themselves." Before he could respond, a loud crash came from the study. They hurried in to find Bunny, flustered, attempting to gather scattered papers from the floor. "I'm so sorry," she cried. "I was looking for a book and I knocked over Letty's box of letters." Miss Marple knelt beside her, helping gather the pages. She noted a torn envelope among the mix, postmarked from Zurich, dated only a few weeks ago. She gently took it. "Bunny, do you know what this is?" Bunny peered at it, squinting. "That's one of the letters she kept hidden. She said it didn't matter, that it was a mistake." Miss Marple opened it carefully. The letter inside was written in a strong, looping hand. It read, "You think time has buried the truth, but you're wrong. I know who you are. Midnight, little paddocks. We end this then." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "This handwriting," she said quietly, "is a woman's." Craddock leaned over her shoulder. "Then the man who died didn't write it. Number he was there because of it. He was summoned, perhaps manipulated." Bunny was trembling. "Letty wouldn't do that. She wouldn't. She's been so kind. She's always looked after me." Miss Marple reached out and gently took Bunny's hand. "My dear, kindness and guilt often walk hand in hand, especially when one is pretending to be someone they're not." Bunny's eyes filled. I don't understand." Miss Marple stood. "Let us take a step back. Years ago, Letitia Blacklock worked as a secretary for a wealthy recluse, Miss Charlotte Godler. Miss Godler left her fortune to her brother's children after her death. But one of those children, Pip or Emma, disappeared abroad, or died. No one quite knew." Craddock blinked. "Are you suggesting—" "I'm suggesting the woman we know as Letitia Blacklock is, in fact, Charlotte Godler's sister, Charlotte herself. The real Letitia died years ago. This woman assumed her identity to inherit the estate." Craddock stood stunned. But that would mean that the man who died came to expose her, or threatened to, and she, or someone protecting her, silenced him. Craddock exhaled sharply. But why go to such lengths? If she had the money already? "She didn't," Miss Marple said softly. "The estate was entailed. It would only become hers upon formal confirmation of Letitia's identity. And with the other heirs presumed dead or missing, it seemed safe. But someone knew the truth, someone from her past." Craddock looked at the papers in disbelief. "So this isn't about greed alone. It's about holding on to a life she built on lies." Miss Marple nodded. "Greed started it, but fear sustained it. And now, perhaps, someone else is caught in the web. Someone who knows the truth and has begun tying off the loose ends." Just then the door creaked open. Julia stood there pale, holding a small velvet box. "I found this," she said, voice tight, "hidden in the drawer of Letitia's vanity." Miss Marple opened the box and gasped softly. Inside was a silver locket, engraved initials, C.G. Inside the locket, two faces, one unmistakably the younger woman in the photograph on the mantel, the real Charlotte Godler. "And the other," Craddock murmured. "Her sister," Miss Marple confirmed. "Letitia." She turned to Julia. "My dear, did you know?" Julia hesitated. "I suspected. I found letters in the attic. but I didn't know someone had died for it." Miss Marple looked at her with grave softness. "Then you may be the last one left who hasn't lied, and that makes you more valuable than you know." She turned to Craddock, voice steady. "We must act swiftly, Inspector, because whoever planned this murder isn't finished. They've silenced one voice, but there are others left in the house who remember, and upstairs, behind a locked door, someone else listened, quietly, planning their next move." The following morning brought a burst of clarity, or so it seemed. A gardener clearing the snow near the hedge discovered a half-buried bundle just outside the grounds of Little Paddocks. Wrapped in a canvas cloth and tied with twine, the object was turned over to Inspector Craddock, who unwrapped it to reveal a second revolver, matching the make and model of the weapon found beside the dead man. But this one had no blood, no fingerprints. What it did have was a silencer still screwed to the muzzle, and tucked into the folds of the cloth, a woman's leather glove. Craddock moved swiftly. The glove was traced almost immediately to Julia Simmons. She had worn the same pair during her morning walks, a detail Bunny vaguely remembered, and Mitzi confirmed with unnecessary enthusiasm. When questioned, Julia was composed but visibly rattled. She claimed she'd lost one of the gloves days ago and dismissed the revolver entirely, but the mounting circumstantial evidence was enough for Craddock. He called the guests together in the drawing-room just after luncheon. "The mystery," he declared, "has been solved." The guests stared, wide-eyed. Even Letitia, no, Charlotte, as Miss Marple now quietly thought of her, looked surprised. Craddock stood beside the fireplace, his presence forceful. "We believe the man who died came here to blackmail Miss Blacklock." A subtle glance from Miss Marple corrected him. "Came here, rather, to blackmail Charlotte Girdler, posing as her sister Letitia. We also believe that this man, whose real identity is now suspected to be Rudy Schertz, a known petty criminal from Zurich, was killed not by Charlotte herself, but by someone trying to protect her secret. Someone close to her. Someone who stood to benefit if her identity remained hidden." He turned to Julia. "We found a glove outside, a gun with a silencer. We believe the first shot was muffled, used to kill Schertz, and the second, fired from the planted gun beside his body, was meant to mimic suicide, a deception, and we believe you planted the second weapon." Julia's face drained of colour. "I didn't kill anyone." "Then explain the glove." "I lost it. Ask anyone. I said so the other day. I have no idea how it ended up outside." Bunny mumbled something, and Letitia, Charlotte, said nothing at all. Craddock pressed on. "Miss Simmons, you had motive. You and your cousin Patrick were both cut off from the inheritance once suspicions about Charlotte's identity began to stir. You needed to protect your future. Killing the blackmailer made sense, and staging a suicide kept suspicion away from your aunt." Julia's voice broke. "You don't understand. There was someone else. That night, I saw him. I didn't say anything because I was afraid." "Who?" Craddock asked sharply. She looked around the room, her eyes falling briefly on Mitzi, then on Patrick before lowering them again. "I don't know. A shadow? A figure? I thought maybe I was imagining it." Craddock shook his head. "You had opportunity, motive, and now we have physical evidence. I'm sorry, Miss Simmons, but you'll have to come with me for further questioning." The room was quiet as Julia was led away. She didn't fight, didn't scream. She simply walked, pale and stiff, out into the hallway, leaving silence in her wake. Bunny let out a loud sniffle. I didn't think she had it in her, but maybe it's the quiet ones always. Patrick stood rigid. "You've made a mistake." Letitia, Charlotte, sat motionless, her teacup untouched. Only Miss Marple showed no reaction at all. Later that evening, Craddock returned to Little Paddocks, exhausted but satisfied. He found Miss Marple sitting by the fire, her knitting returned to her hands, the soft clicking of needles filling the room. "Well," he said, dropping into the armchair beside her, "we have her, and I must admit I didn't see it coming. Clever girl, that one. Very cool under pressure." Miss Marple didn't respond immediately. She counted to 10 in her stitches before setting the needles down. "You don't believe she did it," Craddock said finally. "No," said Miss Marple quietly. "No, I don't." Craddock frowned. The glove, the gun, her evasiveness. It all lines up. "Too well," said Miss Marple. "Too neatly, as though someone wanted us to find exactly what we did, exactly where we found it. Tell me, Inspector, what time did the gardener find the bundle?" Craddock blinked. "About 8 this morning. He said the snow had softened there, as though something had been moved recently." Miss Marple nodded. "Then the gun wasn't discarded during the murder. It was planted last night, after the snowstorm." Craddock sat forward. "You think someone's framing Julia?" "I believe the real killer watched us search, watched us stumble through contradictions, and waited for the moment when we needed something concrete, anything, to tie up the story. And then they gave it to us." Craddock was silent, staring into the fire. "And the motive?" he asked. "If not Julia, then who? And why?" Miss Marple's voice dropped to a whisper. "Think of the letters, the handwriting, the timing, the careful orchestration. This wasn't the act of desperation Julia might have committed. It was cold, calculated. Someone has a deep fear of being exposed, not just for lying, but for becoming irrelevant." Craddock's eyes slowly widened. "Charlotte," Miss Marple nodded. "She's been playing a part for so long, she no longer remembers where the truth ends, and she's not the only one protecting that illusion." She rose and crossed to the hallway, where the grandfather clock ticked steadily. "There's something else, Inspector, something that doesn't fit. Bunny." Craddock turned in his chair. "Bunny? She's the most unreliable witness of all, and yet she never strays from Charlotte's version of events, as if she's memorized it, rehearsed it." Craddock stood slowly. "You think Bunny's in on it?" "I think Bunny knows more than she's been willing to say, and I think someone is making sure she doesn't say it." A knock echoed through the house. A telegram had arrived from Zurich. Craddock opened it quickly, read it, and handed it to Miss Marple. It read, "Confirm identity. Rudy Schurz, clerk at Swiss Bank, terminated for theft, reported missing 3 weeks ago. No known ties to Blacklock family." Miss Marple looked up, eyes sharp. No ties, except the ones someone pretended he had. This man wasn't blackmailing Charlotte. He was lured here under false pretenses. He thought he was meeting someone else entirely. Craddock stared at her. "Then who sent the letter?" Miss Marple smiled sadly. "Not who you think." And far above them, in a quiet room lit only by the flickering shadows of a candle, someone stood at a vanity mirror, wiping away smudged ink from a gloved hand, eyes fixed on a crumpled page bearing Julia Simmons' name. They hadn't finished yet. Not by a long stretch. The night had deepened, and with it, the chill inside Little Paddock seemed to settle into every corner of the grand house. The fire in the drawing-room was reduced to glowing embers, casting flickering shadows that danced on the walls and ceiling. Miss Marple sat quietly in her favourite armchair, knitting forgotten stitches, her mind weaving connections more intricate than any thread. Inspector Craddock stood by the window, staring out into the starless sky. The telegram from Zurich weighed heavily in his pocket, yet it had raised more questions than answers. Rudy Schurz, the supposed blackmailer, had no clear ties to the Blacklock family. So why had he been summoned to this secluded village on Christmas Eve? And why had he died in such a manner beneath the tree? Miss Marple finally broke the silence. "Inspector, have you examined the old files from the village constabulary? The ones relating to the Godler family?" Craddock turned, surprised. "I'm afraid I haven't. I was too focused on the present." "Sometimes," Miss Marple said softly, "the present crime is merely a shadow cast by the past." With a nod, Craddock retrieved a worn leather satchel from the study. Together they pored over yellowed reports and faded photographs, documents long archived, forgotten by most but not by Miss Marple. One file stood out, an incident from 25 years ago, involving a missing woman named Emma Godler. The report detailed her disappearance from Meddenham Wells, a neighbouring village, under mysterious circumstances. Emma was one of 2 heirs to the Godler estate, the other being her sister Charlotte, who had since become known as Letitia Blacklock. Miss Marple tapped the photograph of Emma with a slender finger. Here lies a clue no one has yet considered. Emma's disappearance was never solved, and with her vanished, the estate defaulted to Charlotte. But what if Emma's fate was not as final as presumed? Craddock frowned. You mean Emma could be alive, or that someone has been hiding the truth all these years? Both are possible, Miss Marple replied. But more importantly, I believe someone here at Little Paddocks knows more than they have admitted. The detective's eyes scanned the documents further. A letter stood out, a desperate plea from Emma, dated a month before her disappearance, addressed to a Mr. Patrick Simmons. The letter spoke of blackmail, threats, and a secret that could unravel the entire Gödler fortune. Craddock's eyebrows rose. Patrick Simmons? Miss Marple nodded. He was more involved than he let on. His family's presence at Little Paddocks is no coincidence. They were close to the Gödler legacy, possibly acting as guardians or manipulators behind the scenes. Then Patrick had motive to keep Emma's disappearance quiet, perhaps even to silence anyone who sought to find her. And what of Julia? Miss Marple continued. She is Patrick's cousin. Their alliance could be deeper than mere family ties. They share an interest in preserving the estate's status quo. Craddock frowned. And Bunny? Miss Marple sighed. Bunny's involvement is subtler. She was Letitia's companion, but she carried her own burdens. Letters found in her possession hinted at knowledge of family secrets, secrets she was sworn to protect. Suddenly, a detail Miss Marple had overlooked earlier came rushing back, a phrase uttered by Bunny during the questioning. Like a play it was, Bunny had said. A play? Miss Marple repeated softly. Could this murder be the final act of a drama written years ago? The inspector nodded slowly. If the past is not dead, it surely haunts the present. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock. The butler entered, carrying a weathered box found beneath the floorboards of the servants' quarters during a recent search. Inside were diaries, Emma Gödler's personal journals preserved in brittle pages and delicate handwriting. Miss Marple flipped through them carefully. Entries described a secret engagement to a man named Rudy Scherz, the same name as the dead visitor from Zurich. Emma had hoped to marry him and escape her family's oppressive expectations, but threats, blackmail and betrayal haunted her entries. Craddock's voice was barely above a whisper. So, Rudy wasn't just a thief or petty criminal. He was Emma's confidant, and possibly her victim. Miss Marple's eyes glistened with a faint light. The tangled web is clearer now. Rudy came to Little Paddocks not as an enemy, but as a desperate lover seeking to unearth the truth about Emma's disappearance and the family's deceptions. And someone wanted to stop him. The two glanced toward the closed door where Julia was still detained, her pale eyes reflecting fear and confusion. Miss Marple rose slowly. The crime was never just about money or inheritance. It was about hiding the past that threatens to consume them all. Craddock nodded. Then we must find who feared exposure the most. Miss Marple paused at the threshold of the room. And that, Inspector, is where the shadows have only just begun to fall. The morning light filtered weakly through the frost-tinged windows of Little Paddocks, casting long shadows across the cold wooden floor. The tension within the house had not eased. If anything, it thickened, curling like smoke in every room. Inspector Craddock and Miss Marple had spent the night combing through every detail, every word, yet the killer remained hidden behind layers of carefully constructed lies. Miss Marple sat quietly by the window in the drawing-room, her knitting paused mid-stitch. She observed the household moving like restless spectres, each weighed down by secrets they carried but dared not voice. The truth was shrouded, but she sensed it lay just beyond reach, waiting to be teased free by something unexpected. "Inspector," she said softly, "I believe it is time to test their characters, to shine a light in the corners they hide from. The usual questioning has brought us no closer to the heart of this matter." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "What do you propose?" "A simple but unconventional method," Miss Marple replied. "I wish to gather the suspects in the drawing-room, present each with a small scenario, an invented but plausible detail, and observe their reactions carefully." Craddock frowned. "You mean, lie to them?" "Not exactly lie," she smiled gently. "More like creating a mirror for their own guilt or fear to reflect in." The inspector shrugged. "Well, we're out of options. Let's try it." By mid-morning, All the remaining suspects, Letitia, Bunny, Patrick, Mitzi, and even the returning Julia, were assembled in the drawing room once more. The Christmas tree stood solemn, its twinkling lights casting fragile hope in the dim room. Miss Marple began, addressing the group with her usual calm grace. "I have come across a curious detail while reviewing the evidence. There was mention of a third shot during the blackout, one no one accounted for." She let the statement hang in the air like a ghost. "Suppose," she continued, "that this shot was not a stray bullet, but a warning, a message sent to someone present in this room." Her gaze settled briefly on Patrick, who shifted uneasily. "Now," she said, "imagine that the person responsible has a unique habit. They chew on their fingernails when nervous, a habit well known to those around them." Patrick's eyes flickered to his hands. His fingers moved, but no teeth gnawed at them. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Or do they?" She turned to Letitia. "And what if I told you the murderer used a very particular kind of gunpowder residue, one common only in old firearms such as the antique revolver found among the collection in the study?" Letitia's hand twitched in her lap. I don't see how that's relevant." "Oh, but it is," Miss Marple replied softly, "because it suggests the killer is familiar with old weapons, possibly even fond of them." Mitzi scoffed quietly. "That's nonsense." Miss Marple raised a finger gently. "Please, Mitzi, your skepticism is noted, but consider this. If the killer is so careful, why was there residue found on the collar of one guest?" A pause, then she fixed her gaze on Bunny. Bunny's fingers trembled as she clutched her lace gloves. I have no idea what you mean." "Of course," Miss Marple said, voice light, "but I do, and so does Inspector Craddock." The room's atmosphere grew taut, each breath a measured whisper. Then Miss Marple did something unexpected. She pulled a small mirror from her handbag and placed it on the table. "I want each of you to look into this mirror and say, aloud, what you remember from last night, what you saw, what you heard, and who you thought might have acted suspiciously." One by one, the suspects hesitated, then spoke their versions, their voices soft or shaky. Some recalled shadows in corners, footsteps near the side door, hushed voices. Others denied seeing anything at all. When it came to Patrick, his calm facade cracked. His eyes darted repeatedly toward the mirror, but when asked, he claimed he saw nothing but darkness. Miss Marple watched carefully as the subtle sheen of sweat appeared on his brow. The room seemed to hold its breath. Finally, she said gently, "Patrick, would you like to try again?" The mirror shows us what we often try to hide. Patrick's jaw clenched. He looked at the mirror and then abruptly stood, knocking the chair back with a sharp scrape. "I've had enough of this," he snapped. "You want to accuse me. I've done nothing but try to keep the family together." Miss Marple's eyes never left his face. Keeping the family together sometimes requires difficult choices. Patrick's face twisted with anger and fear. "I didn't kill Rudy Schurz. If anything, I was trying to stop it." "Stop what?" Craddock asked, stepping forward. Patrick's breath hitched. "You don't understand. Rudy wasn't just some blackmailer. He knew things about the family, about the past. He threatened to tear it all apart. I confronted him before the blackout. We argued, yes, but I didn't shoot him." The room erupted into murmurs. Letitia's lips pressed into a tight line. Bunny gasped softly. Julia's eyes widened with sudden understanding. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And yet, someone else in this room may have wanted silence more than protection. Patrick's outburst shows cracks in his facade, but also fear, not only of being suspected, but of what might happen if the past is fully revealed. She turned her gaze toward Letitia. "Your silence speaks volumes. You knew of Rudy's threats. You covered the mirror last night for a reason, not to protect anyone but yourself." Letitia swallowed hard but remained mute. Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, looking out at the quiet village cloaked in snow. Mirrors show us our reflections, yes, but they also reveal shadows behind the glass. Turning back, she fixed each person in turn with a steady gaze. "The real question is, who among you fears the reflection so deeply that you would kill to prevent it?" No one answered, but in that moment, Miss Marple knew the game had changed. The carefully constructed lies were beginning to crumble, and the shadows of deception would soon yield their secrets. The mirror on the table caught the last glimmers of daylight, sparkling like a silent witness to truths waiting to be uncovered. The snow had begun to fall harder now, blotting out the distant hedgerows and softening the edges of the vicarage grounds with a growing blanket of white. Miss Marple stood at the frosted window of the drawing-room, her hands gently folded. Her gaze was not on the weather, but on the empty spot beneath the Christmas tree where the murder had occurred. The room was quiet, the air thick with tension and the scent of pine, smoke and unease. The latest blow had come just an hour before. A small, damning piece of evidence, an embroidered handkerchief stained with what appeared to be blood, had vanished from the police evidence box. Inspector Cray had been apoplectic, demanding an immediate search of the house and grounds. Nothing was found. And now the entire investigation teetered on the edge of unravelling. Miss Marple turned from the window and looked around the room. Everyone had returned at the inspector's insistence. No one was to leave the vicarage until the handkerchief was recovered. The guests sat in wary silence. Dr. Lucien Wetherell rubbed his temples in a manner too dramatic to be natural. Margaret Llewellyn stood stiffly by the fireplace, arms crossed. Mrs. Penelope Gardner kept nervously smoothing her skirt, and Reverend Llewellyn stared into the flames, his face unreadable. The silence was broken by the heavy step of Inspector Cray, returning from a second fruitless search of the upstairs rooms. "Nothing?" he growled. "Not a trace. It's as if it was never there at all." "But it was there," said Miss Marple quietly. "I saw it. You saw it. We all did." Cray turned to her. "Yes, and that's what makes it worse. Someone here has it. Someone here is lying." There was a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, like air being sucked from a balloon. Suspicion rippled across every face. Margaret's voice broke the stillness. "If you're suggesting one of us stole it, that's quite an accusation, Inspector." "I'm not suggesting," Cray said coldly. "I'm saying it. We were making real progress. And now the most significant piece of physical evidence has vanished. This is deliberate obstruction." Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled, though her expression remained mild. "Or desperation," she murmured. "Fear. Panic even." The Reverend turned from the fire. "Miss Marple, are you implying the person who took the handkerchief was afraid of what it might reveal?" "I don't imply," she replied softly. "I observe. And what I observed was not panic. Not at first. That came later. But before that, someone was very calm. Someone who knew exactly what they were looking for." Mrs. Gardner clasped her hands. "But why that particular handkerchief? Surely if someone were going to remove evidence, there are easier things to steal." "Exactly," Miss Marple said, nodding. "Which is why I don't believe the handkerchief was stolen on impulse. It was removed because it was too dangerous to remain where it was." Cray stepped forward. "And what do you think makes it dangerous, Miss Marple?" She turned her eyes on him. "Because it didn't belong to the victim." Silence, then a sharp intake of breath from Dr. Wetherell. "The pattern," Miss Marple continued, "was not masculine. A delicate scalloped edge, pale green thread, and a tiny embroidered P. Mrs. Gardner, Penelope, isn't it? Do you embroider?" The older woman's face had gone quite pale. "Well, yes. I mean, I used to. But You gave many gifts to the vicarage over the years, did you not?" Miss Marple pressed. "Perhaps a handkerchief, a private token, to someone you knew well." Penelope's eyes shimmered with something, tears or fury, Miss Marple couldn't tell. "Yes, to Margaret, years ago." Margaret spun around. "That's a lie. I never—" "Oh, but you did," Miss Marple said gently. "You had a falling out, I think. Something bitter, but the handkerchief didn't disappear then. It vanished now because someone realized it had returned to the crime scene, and it shouldn't have." Inspector Cray frowned. "Are you suggesting the victim had this on his person, and the killer realized it would link them to the scene?" "No," said Miss Marple. "I'm suggesting the victim had nothing to do with the handkerchief. But someone tried to place it near him, to shift suspicion, and someone else realized what it meant." Cray opened his mouth to protest, but Miss Marple turned toward the hearth. "It would be so simple, you see. Take the handkerchief from a drawer in the vicarage, perhaps the guest room, and place it near the body when no one was looking. But that kind of clumsy misdirection rarely works, not when people panic. Margaret's voice rose, tight with anger. You're accusing me now? Not accusing, dear, but you were the only one who left the drawing room for long enough to do it. You fetched brandy, you said, but you were gone much longer than that. Inspector Cray looked from Miss Marple to Margaret. We'll need to check the kitchen and the guest room drawers. Now. But Miss Marple wasn't finished. Of course, if the handkerchief was placed after the crime, it means someone returned to the body. That narrows it further. Not everyone would dare. Cray's brow darkened. You're saying 2 people? One planted the evidence and another removed it. Or the same person did both, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. If they realised their bluff had failed. There was movement from the corner of the room. Dr. Wetherell stood slowly, his face pale. Would you care to explain something, Doctor? Miss Marple asked, without turning. He swallowed. What would I explain? The blood, she said simply. The smear on the handkerchief was very faint, not enough for a fatal wound, but perhaps just enough for a small cut. On your hand, maybe, which you received, while handling something sharp, like the broken ornament that was found by the body. Wetherell's mask of calm cracked. This is preposterous. Miss Marple finally turned to him. Is it? You were the one who rushed to examine the body. You said you found nothing unusual. But perhaps you did find something incriminating, and realised you had to act quickly to shift suspicion. Inspector Cray took a step forward. Dr. Wetherell, I'll need to see your hands. But the doctor stepped back. This is madness, you're chasing shadows. And someone, Miss Marple said, is trying very hard to erase them. Outside, the wind howled against the window panes. Inside, the silence grew deeper than ever. The truth was beginning to surface, but with evidence vanishing and lies compounding, the line between hunter and hunted was becoming dangerously thin. The snow had not yet stopped falling, blanketing St. Aldhelm's in a hush that seemed at odds with the chaos unravelling inside its stately walls. 2 constables flanked the main hallway, eyes flicking nervously between the drawing-room and the stairwell, while the scent of pine and burnt cinnamon still clung stubbornly to the air, as if determined to preserve the illusion of peace. But Miss Marple knew better. She always did. She stood quietly near the hearth, hands folded neatly, her expression calm, yet watchful. It was often in the aftermath of a false resolution that a case revealed its darkest truths, and this one was no different. The supposed culprit, poor young Thomas Cavendish, had been dragged away with far too much satisfaction on the part of the chief inspector. A monogrammed handkerchief and a hastily discovered motive about unpaid debts had apparently been enough, but not for her. Miss Marple had been quietly pursuing her own line of inquiry, one grounded not in the apparent but in the human heart. And something had not sat right since the moment she saw Millicent's reaction to Thomas's arrest. It wasn't shock or sadness, it was calculation. And now, as if in cruel confirmation of her instincts, a new scream sliced through the manor. Miss Marple turned sharply. It had come from upstairs. She was already climbing the staircase before anyone else had moved. "Stay here," a constable barked, but his words died as he watched the elderly lady ascend with unnerving speed. The scream had come from Letitia Cavendish's room, and as Miss Marple pushed open the door, a terrible sight awaited. Letitia lay crumpled on the floor beside her writing desk, one arm outstretched toward an overturned lamp. Her face was pale, waxen. Beside her, the mahogany drawer hung open, its contents spilled, half-written letters, old photographs, and a scorched remnant of what had once been the photograph Miss Marple had seen in the study, the one Letitia had earlier claimed to have misplaced. "She's alive," whispered a voice behind her. It was Dr. Haddock, already moving to her side, unconscious, possibly drugged. "Or silenced," Miss Marple murmured, and just before she could share what she found. Downstairs, chaos returned. Chief Inspector Lestrade thundered up the steps, red-faced and winded. "What in blazes?" "There's been a second attempt," Miss Marple said, without turning. "I suggest you call for a nurse and remove Letitia to safety, and double the guard." Lestrade balked. "Are you saying—" I'm saying the case isn't solved, Chief Inspector, she said coldly, and the real culprit is not only still here, but desperate. As Letitia was carried out on a stretcher, Miss Marple returned to the scene. The photograph fragment that remained showed only a smudge of ink and the edge of what looked like a Christmas ribbon, a detail too trivial for most to notice, but not for her. Later, after the house had quieted again, she returned to the study. There she found Harold Blackwood, the solicitor, nursing a glass of port. "Strange business, all this," he muttered. "I should have left last night." Miss Marple gave him a pointed look. "You were about to, but then something made you stay." "Did it?" He looked up, but the mask had slipped for just a fraction of a second. "Well, yes. Out of concern." Concern for Letitia's health, or concern over what she might find in her father's old desk? His eyes narrowed. "You're making a great many insinuations, Miss Marple." "No insinuations at all. Only truths. You were the last to speak with Mr. Cavendish on the night of his death, weren't you? And yet your name appears nowhere in the witness notes. I was never asked." "A convenient omission," she said, "and now we have a second attack, this time on the one person who might have contradicted your version of events." Harold stood, bristling. "Are you accusing me?" "Not yet," she said simply, "but you're far more involved than you'd like anyone to believe." A soft knock interrupted them. Edith, the housemaid, peering in. "Sorry, ma'am, but someone's moved Mr. Cavendish's old strong-box. It was in the attic. It's gone." Miss Marple's gaze darkened. "Gone?" Harold repeated. "That box was sealed. His father's will was in there. So was the correspondence with—" He stopped. "With whom?" Miss Marple asked, voice low. He hesitated. "No one important." But she saw the fear bloom behind his calm exterior. It wasn't about wealth or inheritance anymore. It was about exposure. Someone was trying to erase the past. That night, Miss Marple asked for the household to gather, what remained of it. In the drawing-room they sat tensely. Millicent, with her sharp smile too ready. Alfred, quiet and pale. Edith in the corner, watching everything, and Harold, now deeply rattled. "I fear I must apologize," Miss Marple began, hands clasped. "You see, I underestimated the danger. Still present in this house." She looked to each of them. "Someone among us has committed not one, but two crimes. The murder of George Cavendish, and the attempted murder of Letitia, and all to conceal something old, something buried beneath years of silence." Millicent scoffed. "Really, Miss Marple, we've already found our killer." "Number, you've found a scapegoat, and he was handed to you far too quickly." Edith spoke up then, voice small. "I saw someone leave the attic last night. I didn't want to say anything. I was afraid." "Who did you see?" Miss Marple asked gently. The room held its breath. "I think it was Alfred." All eyes turned to the younger Cavendish. His mouth opened, then closed. "I wasn't in the attic," he stammered. "I was—" But the words died. The silence that followed was damning. Miss Marple said nothing more that evening. She left the room as murmurs broke out behind her, stepping once again into the hall where the tree still stood, glowing warmly, mockingly over the place where George Cavendish had died. The past had returned with vengeance, and somewhere in its tangled roots was the truth. But with evidence vanishing and suspects turning on each other, Miss Marple knew the next move would have to be hers, and it would have to be swift, because the killer wasn't finished yet. It was a quiet tick of the antique clock that stirred Miss Marple's mind. The old grandmother clock in the Gilchrist parlour, intricately carved with mistletoe and holly patterns, had been silent for years. Estelle Gilchrist had said so herself. And yet it had ticked once. Not twice, not again. Just once. A sound so faint, so lonely it might have passed unnoticed by anyone else. But for Miss Marple, whose days in St. Mary Mead were spent observing the rhythm of small things, one tick from a supposedly silent clock was like a shout in a chapel. She said nothing at first, not even to Inspector Cray. The man, flustered by the second murder, the groundskeeper Joseph found face down in the lake behind the manor, was barking orders and issuing statements with the false confidence of someone eager to wrap up loose ends. He'd already arrested Nigel Kent, the Gilchrist family solicitor, on grounds of embezzlement and motive. The stolen bonds from Matthew Gilchrist's study, recovered from Kent's office safe, had seemed a neat conclusion. Too neat. Miss Marple had her knitting in her lap and her thoughts in the shadows. Nigel was certainly guilty of something, but not murder. His nerves were frayed, yes, his denial too rehearsed. But there was fear in his eyes, not guilt. No, someone else was playing a deeper game. She replayed every interview, every encounter in her mind. Louisa Gilchrist, poised and demure, had been terribly concerned about appearances, more so than grief. She'd fussed over flower arrangements during questioning, clutched a lace handkerchief too clean for real use, and, Miss Marple remembered now, referred to the broken window latch before anyone had mentioned it. Curious. Then there was the young maid, Iris, whose wide eyes and too careful statements had made Miss Marple gently press. "You said you never entered the study, dear, and yet you knew the fireplace was warm that morning?" Iris had turned pale. Only because I passed it when the door was ajar, ma'am. I felt the heat. I didn't go in. Truly. But Miss Marple didn't need a confession to notice a rehearsed line, and the cook, Mrs. Plumtree, who swore she'd seen Estelle weeping over a bundle of letters the night before the murder. "Love letters, if you ask me," she'd muttered, and not from her husband either. A tangle, indeed. But then came the tick, that lonely tick of the old clock, and the memory of Estelle's hand tremor when she poured tea earlier that afternoon. Miss Marple excused herself and returned quietly to the study. The room had been dusted, cleaned, and restored. But not everything was right. She knelt beside the fireplace, ignoring her age and the protest of her knees. A faint smear of soot just beneath the rug's edge, almost invisible. Someone had lit the fire that night, but then tried to hide it. With gloved hands, Miss Marple reached behind the logs and found it. Half-burned papers, too charred to read except for one corner that had escaped the flame. A seal, red and distinctive, with the crest of a boarding school she recognized from one of the Gilchrist nephews' schooling. She placed it gently in her handbag. Back in the hall, the grandmother clock ticked once more, just once. No rhythm. She stepped close, opened the glass face. There, tucked behind the gears, was a tiny wad of cloth. She drew it out. Inside, wrapped like a precious heirloom, was a brooch, opal, Victorian, with a hairline crack down the centre, the same one Louisa claimed had been lost last summer. She held it up to the light, thoughtful. "Miss Marple?" It was Inspector Cray behind her. "What are you doing with that clock?" "I'm simply listening," she said with a smile. "Listening for a pattern." He raised a brow. She patted his arm. "Do you remember Louisa's alibi? That she was asleep all night and didn't hear anything, not even the struggle?" "Yes. She said she sleeps with earplugs. Migraine issues. Yet she said something odd the other day. She told you she heard a fox outside, scratching at the window." Cray blinked. "She did. I didn't think anything of it." "She couldn't have heard both," Miss Marple said gently. "Earplugs or foxes can't be both. And then this clock. It ticked only once. Because someone interfered with the mechanism, likely while hiding something." She opened her handbag and handed him the brooch. Cray frowned. "Louisa's?" "Louisa's. Hidden in the clock after the murder. Most likely dropped during a confrontation, or perhaps when she tampered with something, and she couldn't bear to lose it, so she returned and hid it, rather than dispose of it." He examined the brooch, then looked at her. "And the letter fragments?" "They link Estelle to someone at that boarding school. A man, I suspect. Someone Louisa didn't approve of. I believe Matthew found out. Threatened to change the will. Louisa's fortune was at stake." Cray nodded slowly, realization dawning. "And Joseph?" "The groundskeeper. Perhaps he saw her that night. Perhaps he saw too much. Or perhaps he helped her dispose of something, and she couldn't afford loose ends. Either way, he died after she was arrested and released on bail. Too convenient." Cray's breath grew heavy. "You're suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting, dear Inspector. I'm observing. That's all I ever do." He stood silent a long moment. Then he sighed. "I'll have her brought in again." Miss Marple smiled faintly and resumed her knitting. The pattern, at last, had begun to take shape. not in the yarn between her fingers, but in the long, winding threads of deceit, revenge, and desperation that had knotted themselves beneath the Christmas tree in the drawing-room of Gilchrist Manor. And, like all patterns, once you saw it, every stitch made perfect sense. Even in the dim glow of the drawing-room, something in Miss Marple's expression had shifted. Her eyes, usually soft and gentle, were narrowed with the clarity of a mind aligning its final deductions. She sat forward, her hands resting on her lap, with the same calm patience she had carried since the beginning. But now there was fire behind her calm. Detective Inspector Frayne, having reluctantly come to trust her instincts, stood by silently as Miss Marple asked for all the guests, what remained of them, to gather. Christmas lights twinkled inappropriately in the background, casting coloured shadows on the solemn faces. Everyone had returned to the estate under the pretext of closure and a final statement from the authorities. But Miss Marple had requested this moment, not the police, and despite the pain that weighed down the atmosphere, no one dared question her authority now. She began quietly. Throughout this case, we assumed we were looking for the sort of motive that fits inside a police report: greed, hatred, revenge. But this crime was never just a crime of opportunity. She turned toward Mr. Roland Fairchild, the nephew of the deceased. His hand twitched slightly at the mention. "You see, Roland, you claim to be estranged from your uncle due to financial disagreements. You told us you were only here to mend the relationship. But I found it strange, so very strange, that you remembered the model of toy train he gave you for Christmas as a boy, yet you couldn't recall which bedroom you used to sleep in." Roland stiffened but said nothing. Inspector Frayne crossed his arms. Miss Marple went on, addressing the room. "And then there was poor Miss Langford, Alice. She kept speaking of loyalty and how she had never married because some ghosts are best left in the attic. At first I thought she meant lost love, but no, she meant secrets." Alice looked up, eyes hollow. Miss Marple softened. "You loved Douglas Cranford once, didn't you?" Alice's lips parted slightly. A tremble passed through her. Long before his marriage to Eleanor, before all the money and all the scandal, he was different then, idealistic, kind. And then something happened, something that changed him. The room was dead silent. I discovered it yesterday, hidden in the pages of an old ledger Douglas kept locked away in his study. A letter, a single letter from a woman named Margaret Dane. It was dated the summer of 1938. She spoke of a son, a boy born out of wedlock, hidden away to avoid scandal. Roland's face was ashen now. "That boy was you, wasn't it?" Miss Marple asked gently, turning to Roland. A long pause. Then he nodded, once. "I found out 2 years ago," he said quietly. "By accident. I tracked her down, my mother. She told me everything. How he abandoned her, paid her off, left her to raise me alone while he married into wealth. Do you know what it's like to grow up wondering why you were never good enough for someone's name?" Inspector Frayne took a sharp breath. Roland continued, more bitterly now. "Then I find out he's lived like a king all this time, throwing lavish parties, playing the generous patriarch while the woman he ruined died in a rented flat." "So you killed him," Frayne said grimly. Roland didn't deny it. "Yes. I waited for the Christmas gathering. I knew he'd be vulnerable. He always drank too much, boasted too loud. I slipped into his study that night. I didn't mean to kill him at first. I just wanted to confront him. But he laughed, said Margaret should have been grateful. And when he reached for the bell, He stopped, overwhelmed by the memory. Alice Langford turned to him. "You're my nephew," she whispered. He gave her a pained look. "You knew. Somewhere inside you knew. That's why you protected me." Miss Marple interjected softly. "And the second crime, the murder of Alfred Crane, that wasn't you, was it?" Roland shook his head slowly. "No," Miss Marple said with sad certainty. "That was Eleanor." Gasps followed. Lady Eleanor stepped back, her face unreadable. She discovered Roland's parentage, likely from the same letter, and suddenly the image of the perfect family was under threat. She had lived too long pretending her husband was a faithful, noble man. She couldn't bear the world seeing otherwise. Alfred, Poor, foolish Alfred tried to blackmail her with the truth. He overheard too much, so she silenced him. Eleanor's hands were trembling now. Miss Marple approached her. You didn't kill your husband, but you tried to preserve his memory. You made him a martyr, even in death. Tears rolled down Eleanor's cheeks. Miss Marple turned to Frayne. There you have it, a father's sins, a son's vengeance, a wife's pride, and 2 deaths that might have been avoided if truth had not been treated like poison. The silence that followed was thick and unending. No one moved. At last, Inspector Frayne spoke. Roland Fairchild, you are under arrest for the murder of Douglas Cranford, Lady Eleanor Cranford, for the murder of Alfred Crane. The clinking of handcuffs was the only sound as officers stepped forward. Miss Marple didn't speak again as she watched them taken away. She simply returned to her chair, folding her hands neatly. It wasn't justice that settled in the room. It was the ghost of a family torn by secrets. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again. The drawing room was silent, but for the steady ticking of the clock over the fireplace. Outside, snow swirled against the windows, muffling the world into a hush. Inside, the suspects sat arranged like players on a stage, each in a high-backed chair, hands clasped or fidgeting, eyes flitting nervously between each other, and the quiet woman seated near the hearth. Miss Marple. She didn't look imposing. Draped in a soft wool shawl and holding a teacup with both hands, she appeared more like someone waiting to offer biscuits than accusations. But her gaze was sharp, and behind her mild manner lay an unshakable confidence. She'd summoned them here herself at the invitation of Inspector Darnley, though by now even he had ceded the reins to her completely. A fire crackled softly in the grate. The Christmas tree, once a cheerful centrepiece, now stood like a silent witness beside the hearth, its ornaments dull in the firelight. Beneath it, the place where Albert Netheridge's body had been found now lay bare, the blood-stained carpet long removed, though its memory remained vividly in everyone's mind. Miss Marple set her teacup down on its saucer with a delicate chime. "I imagine," she said gently, "you're all wondering why I've called you here. You see, it's all quite finished now. The threads have been untangled, the mask removed. The murderer has been among us the entire time." No one breathed. Clive Netheridge's jaw tensed, knuckles white on the arms of his chair. Margaret, seated beside him, kept her eyes downcast. Lydia sat ramrod straight, her gaze fixed on Miss Marple with a kind of terrified defiance, and then there was Harold Reeves, arms folded, lip curled in derision. "You're bluffing," Reeves said. "You don't have proof." "On the contrary," Miss Marple said pleasantly, "I have proof enough, though I suspect the truth will sting more than any handcuffs." She rose slowly, smoothing her skirt, and walked to the side table where a small wrapped parcel sat. She lifted the lid. "During the search of Margaret's cottage, the police found this," she said, holding up a tiny porcelain angel ornament. It seemed ordinary at first, but look closer. Beneath the base was a hidden compartment, and inside it— She paused for effect. All eyes were fixed on her. Was the missing page from Albert Netheridge's personal ledger, the one that detailed the transfer of the Foundation's capital into a separate account, an account controlled by Lydia Netheridge. A sharp gasp broke the room's silence. Lydia surged from her seat. "That's a lie! That's not mine!" "Do sit down, my dear," Miss Marple said firmly. "The truth is always hardest to hear, especially when we've gone to such lengths to conceal it. But we mustn't be distracted by false starts. Lydia, you may have profited, but you weren't the one who struck the blow." She turned to Clive. "And you, sir, were quite vocal in your grief, but your alibi for the night of the murder relied solely on Margaret's word. Convenient, considering your long-standing affair." Margaret paled. Clive sat back slowly, the wind knocked from him. Miss Marple smiled thinly. "But that's the trouble with lies. They make such poor companions, always tripping over each other." She stepped back, allowing the firelight to frame her face. "The truth, I'm afraid, lies in the simple question no one asked. Who stood to lose the most if Albert changed his will?" A heavy silence. Then Miss Marple turned slowly to Harold Reeves. "You, Mr. Reeves." Harold stiffened. "You had been embezzling from the charity's investment arm for years. Tiny sums spread thin, but enough to raise Albert's suspicion, especially after that anonymous tip he received last month." He He confronted you, didn't he? And when you realised he intended to expose you, you panicked. Reeves's jaw clenched. He glanced toward the door. You came to the house early, before the Christmas party. Albert had already been drinking. You knew he would be, and you made sure to offer him another glass. You waited until he was slumped in the chair, half asleep, and then used the brass fire poker. No! Reeves roared, standing. That's... Miss Marple didn't flinch. You wrapped the poker in a towel to reduce blood spatter. Then you removed the poker entirely and placed a different one on the stand. Slightly longer, older, but few would notice. Except they did, eventually. It didn't match the soot pattern on the rug. Reeves backed away, but Inspector Darnley was already moving, handcuffs in hand. I didn't mean to kill him, Reeves muttered, face grey. He threatened to destroy me. I just wanted him to be quiet. Just quiet. As Darnley restrained him, Miss Marple turned to the others, who sat frozen in the aftermath of the storm. But I confess, she said softly, it was not the evidence that truly convinced me. It was the music. Everyone looked at her. That evening, the clock had stopped at 7:42 p.m. and the Victrola in the corner was still running, though no one had changed the record. Only someone who felt at home here would have known to turn it on. It was playing Bach. Harold. Albert loathed Bach. You were the only one who could have chosen it. As Reeves was led away into the snowy night, Miss Marple turned back to the hearth, eyes softening. Such a lovely tree even now, she murmured, gazing at the twinkling lights. It's a shame, really, how some people use Christmas to hide the darkest parts of themselves. The fire crackled. Snow fell in silence, and in the stillness that followed, the ghost beneath the Christmas tree finally found peace. The air in the drawing room was thick with relief. The handcuffed Harold Reeves had been led away, the truth laid bare like a shattered ornament. The guests, though shaken, began to ease back into their seats, the long night's tension dissipating like the last flickers of candlelight. Miss Marple herself seemed to relax, folding her hands in her lap and allowing a faint, almost imperceptible smile to play on her lips. But as she glanced toward the window, the sharp crack of breaking glass shattered the fragile calm. Everyone turned as a figure dashed into the room, clutching a small envelope, eyes wild with urgency. It was Edith, the housemaid, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Miss Marple, I found this in the library, hidden behind the bookshelves. She thrust the envelope into Miss Marple's hands before collapsing into a nearby chair. The detective carefully opened it. Inside was a folded letter, the handwriting familiar, yet chilling in its precise cruelty. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the words rapidly. Then she looked up, her expression grave. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, voice steady but low, "it appears we have been dancing around a shadow far deeper than we realized." She turned to Inspector Darnley. "You must understand, Harold Reeves was a pawn, not the player." Gasps rippled through the room. Miss Marple continued, "This letter was written by none other than Clive Netheridge himself. It details a plan to frame Harold for the murder, a scheme hatched months ago when Albert began questioning the charity's finances." Clive's face drained of colour. "Furthermore," Miss Marple said, "the letter hints at knowledge only the murderer could possess, details of the crime scene that were never made public." Margaret gasped. "Clive, is this true?" He swallowed hard, struggling to maintain composure. I was desperate. Albert's discovery would ruin us all. I wanted to protect the family name." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "But desperation can drive men to terrible deeds. And yet," she added quietly, "there is more." She laid the letter on the table and picked up a small, intricately carved key, one she had found hidden beneath the false bottom of a drawer in Albert's study. "This key," she said, "opens a cabinet where the true records of the charity's finances were kept, the documents that reveal who truly controlled the funds and who had the means to manipulate them." Inspector Darnley hastened to the cabinet and unlocked it, pulling out thick ledgers and bundles of correspondence. As he sifted through the papers, Miss Marple's eyes locked on Lydia Netheridge, sitting stiffly by the fire. A subtle tremor passed through the younger woman's hands. "Lydia," Miss Marple said softly, "you claimed innocence, but these documents suggest otherwise. Lydia's eyes filled with tears. I wanted to protect my mother, the family reputation. I never thought it would come to this. Suddenly a new figure appeared in the doorway, the solicitor, Mr. Palmer, who had been notably absent throughout much of the investigation. Miss Marple, he said gravely, I believe you will want to see this. He held out a small envelope, this one bearing the official seal of the Gilchrist estate. Miss Marple took it, recognizing the handwriting immediately. Inside was a confession, carefully composed and unsigned. It admitted to orchestrating the entire tragedy, driven not by money or power, but by a twisted need for control and revenge against a family that had wronged him years before. The real mastermind, Miss Marple said quietly, was not Harold Reeves, nor even Clive Netheridge. It was Mr. Palmer, the solicitor who managed the family's affairs and had intimate knowledge of every secret. A tense silence filled the room. Mr. Palmer stepped forward, his face calm but eyes cold. I confess, yes, it was I who directed events to my advantage. The murders, the misdirections, I pulled the strings. I was patient, meticulous, and above all, untouchable. Inspector Darnley moved to arrest him, but Palmer raised a hand. Do what you must, but know this. The truth is often more complex than it seems, and justice is never as simple as a confession. Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. Justice, Mr. Palmer, is less about punishment and more about uncovering truth, and truth has a way of shining through even the darkest shadows. As Palmer was led away, the assembled group sat in stunned silence. Outside, the snow continued to fall, each flake a silent witness to the tangled web of secrets now unravelling beneath the Christmas tree. Miss Marple looked to the empty space where the tree had stood, a faint smile returning to her lips. Sometimes, she whispered, the greatest mysteries are hidden not beneath the surface, but in the quiet spaces between. The case was finally closed, but the echoes of the past would linger long after the snow had melted away. The courtroom was colder than the harshest winter night outside, its stone walls echoing with whispered rumours and the restless shifting of feet. The trial of Mr. Palmer had captivated the town, drawing neighbours, distant relatives, and curious onlookers alike, each eager to witness justice served, or so they hoped. Yet beneath the polished veneer of formal proceedings, a subtle tension thrummed, as if the very air hesitated to pronounce finality. Miss Marple sat quietly near the back, her knitting folded in her lap, eyes calm but unwavering. Across the room, Palmer's expression was unreadable, a mask carefully maintained, even as the evidence amassed against him grew undeniable. The prosecution laid bare the intricate web Palmer had woven, forged documents, manipulated ledgers, orchestrated alibis, and, ultimately, the chilling confessions smuggled in through the solicitor Mr. Palmer had trusted. Yet, as the lawyers spoke, Miss Marple's mind danced through the shadows of the case's tangled threads. Justice might be claimed on paper, but the truth, her truth, was far more elusive. When the jury retired, the room fell silent. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the small, ornate Christmas tree in the corner, a quiet reminder of the tragedy beneath its branches. It was there, she recalled, that the first misstep had been made. A single, misplaced ornament, a delicate glass angel cracked just so, revealing far more than anyone had realized. After the jury's verdict, guilty had been delivered, a murmur rippled through the crowd, a sense of relief mingled with unease. Palmer was sentenced, but something in Miss Marple's heart whispered otherwise. Later, as the courtroom emptied, Inspector Darnley approached her. "Miss Marple," he began hesitant, "do you truly believe the case is closed?" She smiled, the faintest of smiles. "Closed? No, Inspector. It has been paused, perhaps. But the truth is a living thing. It can hide in plain sight, whispering secrets to those patient enough to listen." He frowned. "You don't suspect someone else?" "I suspect the shadows Palmer cast are longer than we thought. Take, for example, the letters exchanged between the deceased and an unknown correspondent, a correspondence no one sought out, letters hinting at a different motive entirely, one of despair and desperation, not greed." She reached into her handbag and produced a small bundle tied with a faded ribbon. These letters were tucked inside the lining of Palmer's own briefcase, a detail missed by many but caught by an observant eye. Darnley took them, scanning the brittle pages. Miss Marple continued, "They speak of a final plan, one Palmer feared would be uncovered. Someone else, someone closer, might have shared his secret, or even acted on it." The detective's gaze settled on Lydia Netheridge, who was quietly seated nearby, her expression unreadable. It is not uncommon for secrets to breed accomplices, or worse, successors. Later that evening, as snow began to fall once again, Miss Marple sat in the parlour of Gilchrist Manor, the fire crackling softly. She laid out the sequence of events for those willing to listen, the subtle hesitation in Louisa's voice, the warmth of the fire inconsistent with the claimed timeline, the faint scent of lavender clinging to a coat no one claimed. "All small things," she said, "but they add up." She smiled softly. "Justice, I fear, is not always served neatly. Sometimes it is a matter of timing and patience, and sometimes those who walk free do so because the truth remains just out of reach." The final candle flickered low. Outside, shadows lengthened beneath the bare branches of the Christmas tree still standing silent and proud in the corner. Miss Marple rose, gathering her shawl. "The game may be over for now," she murmured, "but the players will remain." As she stepped into the cold night, she knew the story was not yet finished. The true reckoning was yet to come, and when it did, no secret, no matter how well hidden, would escape the light. The dawn broke grey and cold over the quiet village of St. Aldhelm, the soft hush of fresh snow muffling the usual bustle of the streets. Miss Marple pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stepped onto the frost-glazed path leading away from Gilchrist Manor, now left behind like a chapter closed, but not quite forgotten. The Christmas tree, still standing proudly in the grand hall, would soon be dismantled, its sparkling lights and ornaments packed away until next year. Yet to Miss Marple it remained a silent sentinel to secrets far deeper than pine and tinsel. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of revelations, arrests, and confessions, each piece of the puzzle falling into place with a precision that few could have anticipated. Yet, as she walked through the sleepy streets, the sense of resolution felt incomplete, like a story with its final sentence missing. Her thoughts drifted back to a small detail that had nagged at her from the very beginning, a delicate scar on a letter found among the papers, almost invisible to the untrained eye. It had been dismissed as a smudge, a careless crease, yet its pattern was oddly deliberate. A tiny symbol, a flourish that matched none of the known correspondence. Miss Marple paused at the village post office, where the young clerk greeted her with a polite nod. She glanced at the pile of returned Christmas cards stacked behind the counter. Among them, one card stood out, a simple envelope addressed in unfamiliar handwriting, postmarked weeks after the last confession. Curious, she slipped it into her bag, her fingers tracing the seal, a faint impression of a crescent moon entwined with ivy. The letter inside was brief and cryptic. "The past never truly dies. Watch the ivy. It climbs where the truth fears to tread." Miss Marple's lips curved into a thoughtful smile. She tucked the note carefully into her coat pocket and continued her stroll toward the village green, where children were already playing in the snow, their laughter pure and untroubled. It was a comforting contrast to the shadows she carried with her. At the edge of the green stood the ancient ivy-covered wall that bordered the village churchyard. She stopped, staring up at the thick tendrils weaving through the stonework, their dark leaves shimmering with frost. "Watch the ivy," she whispered to herself. A faint breeze stirred the leaves, revealing a glint of something hidden beneath the greenery, a corner of weathered parchment tucked into a crevice. With careful fingers, Miss Marple retrieved the paper. The faded ink bore a single line. "Not all endings are as they seem." Her heart quickened, not with fear, but with the thrill of the unknown. For a detective like Miss Marple, the absence of certainty was never a cause for despair, but an invitation, an open door waiting to be crossed. She folded the note, slipped it back into her pocket, and looked once more at the ivy-clad wall. The mystery was far from over. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows over the snow, Miss Marple turned her steps toward home. The village's quiet streets beckoned with the promise of new questions, and the steady rhythm of a life lived in careful observation. Because in the world of secrets and lies, one thing was certain: there was always another story waiting to be told, and she would be ready. The faintest smile lingered as she disappeared into the morning mist, leaving behind only the soft crunch of footsteps in the snow and the whispered rustle of ivy against ancient stone.